In the Wild West, a rancher bought a cabin for 12 cents. Inside, he found a hanging Apache girl still alive. What happened next changed everything. If you love emotional frontier tales, like and subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's get started in the heart of 1869 New Mexico. The sheriff's voice rang out as he declared the abandoned cabin sold for 12 cents. Laughter rippled through the crowd, rough voices mocking the man who had dared bid on land no one else wanted. Daniel, a weathered rancher with calloused hands and lines etched by sun and sorrow, ignored them. His life had taught him that gold wasn't always measured in coins. What he sought wasn't profit but a roof against the prairie winds, a place to rest his bones after years of wandering from one failed promise to the next. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a dry gulch, its roof sagging and walls bruised by storms. As Daniel rode closer, his horse stamped nervously, ears flicking as if sensing something unseen. The rancher swung down, boots crunching in the dust. He laid his hand on the warped doorframe, feeling the weight of silence inside. The place looked as if it hadn't heard laughter or even footsteps for years. Still, it was his now, bought fair and square, for less than the price of a loaf of bread. With a grunt, Daniel pushed open the heavy door. The hinges moaned like a wounded animal, and dust swirled in the thin beams of sunlight, breaking through the cracks. He coughed into his sleeve, stepping across the creaking floorboards. Every corner smelled of sorrow, stale air, rotting wood, and something darker beneath. He thought of the stories the townsfolk whispered, that men who slept here woke screaming, or never woke at all. He had dismissed them as drunk gossip, but standing inside he began to wonder. Then his eyes caught something that froze his blood. From the rafters hung a body, tall and motionless, swaying ever so slightly, as if stirred by the draft through broken boards. A noose dug into her throat, her dark hair tumbling like a river to the floorboards, strands brushing against the dirt. She was massive, towering even in death, the frame of an Apache girl who must have stood nearly 6.5 feet tall in life. Daniel's chest tightened, his breath ragged, his hand instinctively gripping the handle of his knife, though no threat remained. For a moment, Daniel could not move. The world outside, the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, fell away. All he could hear was the echo of his own heartbeat, hammering against his ribs. He wasn't afraid in the way a man fears rattlesnakes or bullets. This was different. It was the weight of a story pressing down on him. The unspoken question of why this girl had ended her life, or had it ended by another's hand. His weathered soul, scarred by loss and hardship, felt the pull of her tragedy like a hook in his chest. The Apache settlers had been locked in bitter struggle for years, each side bearing scars too deep for forgiveness. Daniel himself had buried friends killed in raids, and yet here, confronted with the fragile stillness of a young woman, he could not summon hatred, only sorrow. Her bare feet dangled inches above the ground, toes pale and stiff, as if reaching for life that had slipped away. He stepped closer, hat in hand, bowing his head not out of fear, but out of respect for the dead. A whisper of doubt gnawed at him. What if she hadn't chosen this fate? What if someone had dragged her here, silenced her voice, and left her body to rot in a cabin sold off cheap to cover the shame? The thought struck him like a branding iron to the chest. He had known cruelty in men, seen how power twisted them, how vengeance made monsters. This girl might be another victim of that same merciless world. His hands trembled as he reached toward the rope, hesitating as though touching her fate might entangle him in it forever. He stepped back, dragging air into his lungs, trying to steady himself. The cabin suddenly felt alive with shadows, the corners darker, the silence thicker. His horse whinnied outside, as if sensing his unease. Daniel muttered a prayer under his breath, something he hadn't done in years, a plea for clarity, for peace for her soul. But no answer came, only the quiet sway of her hair against the floor. He felt like an intruder at a funeral, a trespasser in a grief too deep for him to name. The longer he stood there, the more the details struck him. The rawness of the rope, freshly frayed. The bruises on her wrists suggesting a struggle. the faint trace of dried blood at her temple. This was no ordinary death. It spoke of violence, of injustice, of secrets buried in silence. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had bought the cabin to escape hardship, not to inherit another man's ghosts. And yet, here she was, demanding through her very stillness that her story not be forgotten. He could not turn away now, not without betraying something in himself. His hand brushed the rope once more, rough fibers scratching his skin. He imagined her last moments, whether she had cried for mercy or simply stood proud, refusing to break even in death's grip. That kind of strength, that kind of suffering was not meant to vanish into dust. Daniel's jaw clenched, eyes burning with a grief he couldn't explain. For 12 cents, he had not just bought an abandoned cabin. He had bought the burden of a soul whose story was now bound to his own. And he knew, even as the prairie wind rattled the windows, that his life would never be the same again. The floorboards groaned beneath Daniel's boots as he stepped closer, his eyes locked on the hanging girl. Then it happened, a faint, shuddering gasp that froze his blood. Her chest rose, barely, as if life clung stubbornly inside her battered body. Daniel staggered back, disbelief striking harder than any bullet. She was alive. The noose had not finished its merciless work. The thought shot through him like lightning. He hadn't bought a tomb for 12 cents. He had bought a moment where death itself faltered, and fate placed a life in his calloused hands. Without hesitation, Daniel lunged forward. His fingers shook as he drew his hunting knife and sawed through the coarse rope, each fiber fraying with stubborn resistance. Time felt stretched thin, every heartbeat a drum of urgency. At last, the rope snapped, and the girl's body fell limp into his arms. He lowered her carefully onto a dusty blanket, his breath ragged, his pulse hammering with desperation. Her skin was cold, almost lifeless, yet warmth lingered faintly, like embers buried in ashes waiting to be stirred back to flame. "Breathe," he muttered hoarsely, pressing his ear to her chest. A faint thud answered, fragile but real. Relief flooded him, but there was no time to celebrate. He wrapped the blanket tight around her tall frame. Pulling it close to the fire, he quickly stoked in the old hearth. Sparks leapt, flames rising as if called by his urgency. He rubbed her hands, her wrists, willing life back into her. For years he had faced storms, wild animals, even gunmen, but never had he fought so fiercely against silence, against death itself. Her breaths came shallow, uneven, yet they came. Her eyelids flickered, lashes trembling against her pale skin. Daniel leaned closer, whispering words he hadn't spoken to another soul in years. "Stay with me." "You're safe now." His own voice cracked, surprising him with its rawness. He had thought himself empty after burying too many friends, too many dreams. But here, kneeling beside a stranger, he felt his heart pounding with purpose. She stirred faintly, a weak sound escaping her throat, and her eyes fluttered open just enough to find his face in the firelight. The gaze nearly unraveled him. Her dark eyes, clouded with pain and confusion, locked onto his with a strength that seemed impossible for a dying woman. She didn't know his name, nor why she still breathed, but in that fleeting glance, something passed between them, an unspoken tether. Daniel felt it like a weight and a gift all at once. This wasn't chance. This was the frontier's cruel hand, dealing him something far heavier than land or cattle. She had been left to die, but now she was his responsibility, his burden, his test. As the fire warmed her, he worked steadily, forcing broth from his pack to her lips, drops sliding down through most spilled. He didn't care. Every swallow, no matter how small, was victory. He bound her bruised wrists, cleaned the blood at her temple, covering her with every blanket he owned. All the while his thoughts spun like dust in a storm. Who had done this? Why had she been left here, strung up like a warning? Anger stirred deep in his chest, a heat that threatened to consume him. But stronger than anger was determination. She would not die here. Hours passed as wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside the fire glowed brighter. The girl's breaths grew steadier, her skin regaining faint color. Daniel sat slumped beside her, exhaustion dragging at his bones, yet he refused to sleep. His gaze lingered on her face, so young and fierce, even in weakness, and he marveled at the strength it must have taken to survive the rope's choke. He thought of his 12-cent purchase, how neighbors had laughed at him, called him a fool. But now he knew better. This cabin had not been cursed. It had been chosen for him. When dawn broke, pale light spilled through the cracked shutters, touching the girl's face. Her eyes opened wider this time, focusing, though still hazy. Daniel leaned close, offering her water. She swallowed weakly, then rasped a single word in her native tongue. Though he didn't understand, the tone carried gratitude, fragile but undeniable. He felt his throat tighten, emotions long buried clawing their way back to the surface. For years, he had lived as though nothing in the world depended on him. But now in this broken cabin, one life did. And he had no intention of failing her. She drifted in and out of sleep as the day wore on, and Daniel tended to her with the patience of a man who knew hardship. He spoke to her softly, though he wasn't sure she understood. Stories of the prairie, of storms and horses, of the wife he had buried years ago. He told her these things not to fill silence, but to remind himself he was still human, still capable of care. And each time she stirred, each time her eyes fluttered open, he felt the tether between them grow stronger, binding two strangers in the crucible of survival. By nightfall, she was resting more easily, color returning to her cheeks. Daniel sat by the fire, shoulders slumped, yet his eyes never left her. The prairie outside remained merciless, the world still filled with dangers and secrets. But inside the cabin, a miracle had taken root. For 12 cents, he had not bought a broken cabin. He had bought the chance to wrest a soul from death's grip. He knew the road ahead would be hard, that her presence would change everything. Yet in his heart, a certainty bloomed. The curse was never the cabin. It was loneliness, and now it was broken.